And welcome back to session 3 of the Location Analytics Alteryx GIS webinar series. So if you've been following along the last 2 weeks, we started out with some very basic location analytics and spatial analytics processes, such as geocoding and creating trade areas. And then last week, we moved into a little more intermediate work. We looked at demographic data and doing spatial match, where you overlay different layers and look at the relationships between them in a spatial manner. So today we're actually going to dive into the advanced side of spatial analytics in Alteryx. And so you'll get to see some of my most favorite parts of Alteryx. I'm very excited to show this to you. Not only are we going to look at spatial processes, and namely the spatial process tool, but we're going to do some of my most favorite things in the world, which is to make a map. So I'll be showing you step by step how to make maps in Alteryx, how easy it is to put those maps together, and then a bonus at the end to show how to burst those maps into a shared directory. So with that, I'll move forward here for our PowerPoint presentation. Again, to go over our agenda, we're going to look at spatial processes, and these are going to include how to combine spatial objects, intersect, cut, and buffer spatial objects. We're also going to generate lines and polygons on the fly using the map input tool in Alteryx. And then, as I said, one of my favorite things, to create maps. So again, just a little bit about me. If you haven't been able to join our first and second session the last 2 weeks, I'm Deanna Sanchez. I'm very privileged to be an Alteryx ACE, and I am a senior consultant at Technion Data Solutions. I started using Alteryx way back when in 2005, almost 15 years ago. And I've been co-leading the Dallas Alteryx user group for about 5 years. And I launched the Fort Worth Alteryx user group last year, and it's growing quickly. Our Dallas user group is now over 320 members and still growing constantly. So again, it's a privilege to be helping to lead those groups also. So a little bit about spatial processes. You see here on the screen, there's a map of the drive time trade areas. We created this in session 1 using 10 stores in the Denver area, and then creating those trade areas around each store with a 10-minute drive time. So spatial processes are where we, again, overlay those map layers, kind of like you're doing in a spatial map or a spatial match. But now you're going to actually perform some combining of those objects, or finding the intersection between them, or even cutting those objects using another spatial object. So we'll dive into that today, and you can see what the process is, literally, for each of these. I wanted to mention there's the spatial process tool, but the summarize tool also has spatial processes embedded in it. This is not widely known, so I'm excited to show you these little tips and tricks about how you can also use the summarize tool to combine and intersect, and when to use which one. When would you use spatial process to do that, and when do you use summarize to do that? So for combine, you really are creating one output. For example, combining polygons into one large polygon. So on the screen on the maps, you see those 10 drive time areas that we generated in session 1. What if we want to call that our Denver market? What if we want to combine all those polygons and then look at the demographics for the entire market instead of looking per trade area one at a time? You would actually use the combine process. And as I mentioned, there are 2 ways to do that. There's the summarize tool. That works if you combine from one input, and then your spatial process tool combines objects from 2 inputs. So there's a right time to use each one. You can also intersect those spatial objects. So this is overlapping those areas and finding where those intersections happen. So these same drive times here, now you look at those little intersection areas where those drive times overlap. This is really useful if you're, say, in retail or the restaurant business, and you want to actually see where your store trade areas might be cannibalizing each other. What if you actually need to optimize that store layout and say, I need to actually relocate one of these stores. It is cannibalizing or overlapping that trade area greatly for this other store. You would use intersect to do that. Again, you can do it in summarize or spatial process. Summarize is for one input, and spatial process is for 2 inputs. There's also cut spatial objects. So it's usually when you have two polygons and you want to cut first from second. So you're using one of the polygons as an overlay or a cookie cutter to cut out one of the other polygons. So as you can see here, we've got two radii. Cut first from second is just taking that top right radius and cutting it and cutting into the second radius, and you have the leftover. The vice versa happens where you cut second from first. So you can see it's really one of those operations. And as I dive into that, I'll give you a little bit more information on how that works. You can also generate points, lines, and polygons with the map input tool. So this is a really useful tool. We'll actually digitize a line today and a polygon, and then you can actually output those in various spatial formats, such as an Esri or ESRI shapefile or .shp, mapinfo tab file, .tab, Google Earth KMLs, and an Alteryx database or YXDB file, which also holds spatial object fields. And lastly, you can create maps. So we're going to use the report map tool, and you're going to see how it works. There's a data view where you configure the incoming data. Then there's a layer view to prepare your map layers. And in the layer view, you can decide which data sets to actually show on your map. You don't have to show all the data coming into the data view. You can pick and choose and decide what layers you want to concisely show on that output map. In Alteryx, as with other mapping software, you can do thematic maps. We've got equal records, equal ranges, even unique values, lots of color ramps to choose from, labeling options, and much more. So we'll actually dive into how this works. So now we'll actually see this in action. We're going to use that store trade area file we generated from sessions 1 and 2. Going to dive into spatial processing. And then we're going to create maps and reports. So with this advanced series, now you can ask even more questions and get answers to them than you did in sessions 1 and 2. For example, as I mentioned, if you combine trade areas, you can say, what are my main demographic segments for my entire market? What are those overlap areas between store trade areas, which is intersect? How do I find all the block groups outside of a city limit boundary? That would be cut 1 from 2 or cut 2 from 1. And if you want to draw a custom polygon region, where do you start? You start with the map input tool. And also, how do I show median household income by ranges on a map of my research area? And are there any pre-formatted demographic reports available? And yes, there are in Alteryx. So you don't have to write a bunch of code to put these variables together to generate a nice demographic report. I'm going to show you a pre-formatted demographic report in Alteryx. So with that, I'm going to now share my screen here, and you can actually see Alteryx in action. So I've got Alteryx up and running, and first we're going to dive into that spatial process side of things. So I'm going to bring in a file that we have seen many times now for the last 2 weeks. I'm going to bring in that store and trade area file that we generated. I also wanted to mention this stores and trade area file, along with some other sample files, will be distributed after this third session to those who have attended the sessions. So you'll be able to follow along and create some of this data yourselves. So I'm going to go to File, and I'm going to say Stores and Trade Areas. This is a YXB, which is an Alteryx database, and I like to save it in that format because, as you see with the browse here, I can run it, I can look at the data, and I can store more than one spatial object field per record for each one of these. So as I click on the record, you can see it change in the map. I've got a store spatial object, which is the point, and the trade area spatial object around it, all per record. So looking at this data, I actually want to go in and combine the data set. So I can actually do that very quickly with the Summarize tool. So in the Summarize tool, I can actually choose a spatial object, then click Add and go down to my spatial options here. So there's quite a few things you can do. You can combine, create an intersection. You can even create a bounding rectangle, which is a rectangle that encompasses all of the polygons coming in. You can create a convex hull. This is a more advanced process. If, say, you had a series of points, say, like the stores we have here in Denver, and you want to make a polygon that touches all of those points but creates the smallest possible boundary while touching all of those points, that's a convex hull. You can also create a centroid, and a centroid would be coming out of the center of the polygon. So, for example, if you had a zip code coming in, you can create centroid. There's the center of your polygon. So I'm actually going to do spatial and then combine. It's that simple. I've got a spatial object combine trade area. Spatial object is my output name. I can actually change that, but in the interest of time, I'm just going to leave it as is because it lets me know it is combining. So you can see that ran in 0.3 seconds. It's taking 10 different polygons, all of these individual trade areas here, and now it's combined them. This is now one object inside one combined field. So now I have my entire market. So I can say, this is the Denver market. Now I want to append demographic data. So we're going to go over to the Allocate Demographic Analysis toolset, which I introduced you to last week. And instead of doing an allocate input, which we actually would use if we're starting with block groups or census tracts and so on, I'm going to use the allocate append. This actually appends demographic data into the area or polygon that I've created. So I'm going to use an allocate append. And on this one, I want to make sure my records are custom geographies. You can choose the other types of geographies available if you want. But this is a custom geography. We've combined a trade area into a combined spatial object. So now I've got that combined object. I actually want to go into my mosaic household distributions. We saw these mosaic segments last week, and it's really your lifestyle segments. So I'm going to just click on households. I want all of the household counts per each of these 71 segments for lifestyles that are available for my market area. So I want to get a count of all of those inside of those household distributions. So now that I've added this, I'm appending the data. I'm going to add a browse tool. And now you can see immediately, here's my combined spatial object, and here are my segments, AO1, AO2, AO3. So this cryptic field name here is mosaic, households, and then the segment type. So now I can see my counts of households inside of this combined trade area. But what if I want to sort on how those households, which ones are those highest segments for my area? It's really hard to sort this way with the fields going across. So I'm going to use a handy little tool. And this tool is actually in your transform tool category. I'm going to use transpose. As you can see visually, it's taking the horizontal fields and it's going to transpose them into vertical. So for those who use Excel, this is very similar to a pivot table. So it's a very easy configuration here. I've got transparency into exactly how I want that transpose to happen. So I want to keep the spatial object as my key field, but I want to transpose all the other fields, all 71 of these segments. I'm going to transpose and make them vertical. So now I'm adding a browse tool here and I'm going to click run. So it was that simple. Now I've actually switched from this horizontal view, and now I've got a vertical view. So here's under the name field, all of my segment types, and then the value. So now I can actually sort on that value, and we'll see which ones come to the top. So it's that easy to sort. I'm going to sort on value in a descending order, and then I'm going to add a browse tool here. So I'll click run. And now you can see this top one is actually households base. So this is my base value for households. This is included in the mosaic segment data so that you can perform calculations with your base household count. But those O54s, those striving single scenes that's actually the name of the segment, in the Denver area, those are definitely my highest value. Just like we saw last week, O54 rose to the top for many of those trade areas. It's definitely a striving single scene in Denver for my entire market. So that's a quick way to do combine, especially when you have one input. You would use the summarize tool for that. So now I'm actually going to do an intersection. And the way I actually want to do the intersection is overlap. So I could use this as a single input, but there is a caveat. If I did this intersect here, if there are any trade areas here that are by themselves and do not have an overlapping area, this process will output a null value. It only wants things that overlap if you use the summarize tool. So we're actually going to use the very handy spatial process tool to do this. Spatial process will take in two inputs, but the inputs have to be side by side, such as spatial object here, per record, in order for it to record by record, object by object. So I'm going to show you a tip and trick here that you can use. I want to take these trade areas and copy them upon themselves and then perform that intersection. So I'm going to use a select tool here. Select's really handy for a lot of things, but it's also great for just making a copy. So I'm going to rename my trade area spatial object and call it intersect trade area. This way I can tell the two apart. Next, I'm going to use the join category and use the append fields tool. Append fields is really useful when you want to append spatial data to each other. So now I've got my target and my source, and these are actually the same. It's just repeating these overlapping one on top of the other. So I'm actually going to append each of them. I'm going to deselect this radius size. It's already present in the target, but I'm going to leave everything else when I append the data to each other. And it's always good practice to rename your spatial objects, because now I have a trade area spatial object and an intersect trade area spatial object. These are actually one on top of the other. So one thing I need to do is actually remove any stores that match to themselves, because store 100's trade area is going to match perfectly on top of store 100's trade area. It's going to be a perfect intersection. So to remove that, I can quickly add a filter tool. And I'm just going to set up a filter here and do a custom filter. And I'm going to say the store number does not equal, or not equal to, just that exclamation mark and then the equal sign, and then the source store number. That way store 100 does not equal store 100 for both target and source. So I'm going to actually change here and show my connection progress, make sure that's on, because I want to see some numbers come through. I'm going to add a browse tool here. And now I have 90, and that's correct. Out of 100 stores, 10 stores for a trade area, 10 of those are going to match onto themselves. So now I should only have 90. So store 100 should match to all 9 other stores. Store 101 matches to all 9. This equals 90. So you can actually see now, got these all together. And now I can actually do this spatial process of intersect. So I'm going to use the spatial process tool here. And you can see in the spatial process what the configuration looks like. So with this configuration, I've got an option to combine objects. And I've got a nice visual here that lets me know what that looks like. I can cut first from second, which is where I take first here, that top polygon, and I'm cutting out what's left over on the second, or vice versa. Take the second and use that to cut the first. And I can create this intersection object. So between 1 and 2, item 3 here in green is the overlap area. I can also create an inverse intersection object. So I'm taking out whatever overlaps and leave behind what doesn't. So here I want to do a create intersection object. And I want to make sure that it's not my store points, but my trade areas that are actually intersecting. So I've got my trade area spatial object, my intersect trade area, and then I'm going to create that intersection object. So now we'll see what that looks like. I'll go ahead and click Run here. And now you can see in the map looks pretty normal. Where are those intersections? I'll show you how to see that. So now you can see there's a new field added, which is an output called Spatial Object Process. So some of these are null. There's only the ones that actually have polygons are the ones that have an overlapping area, such as store 100 and store 105. They actually overlap each other. To view that, over here in the map where it says 5 of 5 fields, I could actually start taking off some of my objects. So here's my trade area spatial object. Here's my intersect trade area. And now what's left over is that spatial object process. So again, just to show you what that looks like, there are the trade areas. If I turn that off visually, I'm just showing my spatial object process. So now you can see highlighted in blue those overlapping areas, and now I could calculate area in square miles, or if I had customers overlaid on top of this, I could do a count of customers and how many are being cannibalized per store, and so on. So that's the really useful way of doing intersection here. So just to look at that quickly, I can actually add another filter and take out all of those that are spatial processes where it's not null. So I'll just do a basic filter. Scroll down to Spatial Object Process, and I'll use is not null. So it writes the formula for me in the correct syntax in the custom filter. And now I'm going to add a true output browse and click Run. So now you can see there's actually only 22 that actually did have an overlapping area. Again, to see those, I just turn off visually all the other spatial objects, and here's my spatial object in the process output. So that's how to do an intersect with two intersection areas. This is taking the same trade area, overlapping it on top of itself, and then finding those intersection areas. So something else I want to show in that spatial process tool is that cut one from two. So I'm going to bring in a different type of data, just a radius here. And I'm going to go back to my files, and I'm going to bring in store 100 with a radius. And I'm going to bring in another store, that's store 101, with a radius also. And then I'm going to show you a tip and trick. If you hold down Control, I can select both of these. I can do Control-Shift-B and add a browse tool right after that. So if you like hotkeys, it's Control-Shift-B when the tools are highlighted, and now you have a browse. So I like to put those tips and tricks in there as we move along. So here's store 100 near Aurora, between Aurora and Denver, Colorado. And here's store 101 near Inglewood. So I want to actually do a spatial process. And because spatial process has only one input, I need to align these side by side. So to do that, I'm going to append them again using that append fields tool. Here's my target. Here's my source. It doesn't really matter because they're both radii. I'm just going to leave everything as a default. And now they're going to be appended to each other in one row. So click Run. And now you see one record, one row, store 100, it's polygon, store 101, it's polygon. Now I can perform a spatial process on this. So I'm going to add the spatial process tool. And I'm going to say, let's cut one from two. So we'll do spatial object trade area and source spatial object trade area. These need to be different so they can actually see visually an actual cut happening. So I'm going to cut first from second. So I'm using the first radius as an overlay, clipping the second, and then leaving the output. So I'm going to add a browse here. And now you can see what that looks like. So again, in my visual for the map, I'm going to turn off the store spatial objects, which are the points, turn off that trade area, and now I see the leftover in the process. So again, here's store 1. I'm using store 1 to cut store 2, and now I've got this spatial object process left over. I did want to add, for those ESRI or Esri users and MapInfo users out there, the true GIS professionals out there, this is very different than a clip in Esri. So the clip process actually uses the object as a cookie cutter, and then you see what's left inside of that. This is very different where it shows what's left outside of that cookie cutter. So just wanted to mention that I've been an Esri user since 1997, MapInfo since 2005. I love them both, but for those GIS users out there, this is different than a clip, absolutely. So I also wanted to go back and just change it. Let's do cut second from first and see what happens. So now you can see the output. And now I used that second trade area to cut the first. And then now's my output. So here's what's left over from that cut. So this is very useful. As I mentioned in the questions, what if you want to use a city limit boundary and clip all the block groups, and you want to see what's outside of that city limit boundary? You can actually use this cut process to do that. So next I'm going to show you something called the map input tool. And this is a really fun tool. This is in your in-out category, and it's just called map input. And this is where you can actually draw your own lines and polygons. So I've got two set up here. I'm actually going to draw a line here, and I'm going to call it a road trip, for example. So I live near the Dallas area. What if I want to do a road trip from Dallas up to Oklahoma City? I can actually draw a line to do that. So I'm actually going to click here. First I want to show there is an option to draw points. You just draw a point, click wherever you need to manually put that point, and then it's set. You can draw a polyline or you can draw a polygon. So I'm going to click on line, and now I'm going to start drawing. So I'm just going to click once to start at Dallas, next in Denton, go up I-35 here, and then go all the way up to Oklahoma City. I'm going to double click to finish. Now I'm going to enter a label. So I'm going to call this road trip, and that's my label. Now I've drawn this feature. The really neat thing is I can output this, but I can also do more than that. So I'm going to show you what that looks like in a browse. And here's my line. This is now a spatial object. It's in the spatial object field. So now I can actually buffer that line. So going back to my spatial tools, I can choose a buffer option. I'm going to add buffer here. And now that I have a spatial object of a polyline, now I've got a buffer. I have my spatial object. I can set a value. I'm going to say 20, and you can do miles or kilometers. So I'm going to say, let's buffer this with 20 miles. I'm going to add a browse tool here, and then click run. And you can now see a buffer around my line. So I originally had the line there, now I have a buffer object. So if I was on a road trip and I wanted to, say, have a point file of all the restaurants between Dallas and Oklahoma City, but I only wanted to get off the beaten path about 20 minutes or 20 miles, I could overlay, using the spatial match tool that we saw last week, all those restaurant points, perform a spatial match, and now I have a list of restaurants within my 20-mile limit here, or buffer around that line for my road trip. So that's how easy it is to actually buffer. I just had a very simple configuration there. I'm going to actually output this data. So I can output this line and buffer I created myself. I'm going to output the buffer to a file. And as mentioned, I can actually output it to quite a few spatial options. There's the Esri shapefile or a personal geodatabase or a .mdb. You can do MapInfo tab or table files, or even interchange files, .mid, MIF, Google Earth KMLs, and the Alteryx database file. I'm going to save it as a shapefile, and I'm going to call this road trip, and then leave it as .shp. I'll click Save. It's going to ask me what spatial object I want. For this one, it's only a buffer. I can change my projection if I want to. And I'm going to go ahead and click Run. So now you can see I've got my road trip output. If I click on the workflow, it said a record was written to road trip shape. Now I can use that shapefile in other software or pull it into another workflow. And now I have that ready to use. So I created that line and buffer myself. I'm also going to show you something else you can do. So using another map input tool, I'm going to zoom in here to say the Dallas, Fort Worth, Denton Metroplex, and I want to make a region. And I'm going to make this manually. Sometimes you just want to make some manual regions because census tracts and so on may not be exactly what you're looking for. So I'm going to just draw a polygon. Click here up in Denton, click once to make my vertices, and keep clicking over here, and then double click to finish. I'm going to call this one region, and I'm going to save it. And now I've got my own region that I just created. I'm actually going to output this, and I'm going to output it as a Google Earth KML. I'm going to show you something cool if you output to Google Earth. It's just something fun, especially when you're presenting. It's great to use. So I'm going to do a Google Earth KML file. This technique works if you have Google Earth already installed, the thing I'm about to show you. So we'll do KML. It's going to ask you for a name field. You can leave it blank if you want. I'm going to make it a label, not have a description, and my spatial object is spatial object. I'm going to go ahead and run. It's going to output to KML. And you'll see here, as I mentioned on the first session, anytime you have a link in your results window for your workflow, and you get to this window by clicking anywhere on your white space, click on the link and watch what happens. It's going to launch Google Earth for me. I'm not even clicking on it. And it's going to zoom to exactly that region for me. I'm not doing any of this myself. So this is really impressive. Like if you've got a region you want to highlight and show, output it as a KML, click on it, and then Google Earth launches. It zooms directly to where your region is, or point or line that you just created. So here's my region in red. And you may be wondering why the Millennium Falcon is somewhere in Dallas here. So if you are wondering why the Millennium Falcon is in Dallas, please go to the technionyusa.com website and look at videos and watch my video about geocoding. There's a reason why the Millennium Falcon is in Dallas. But that's pretty cool about Google Earth, actually. So I'm going to just discard that. And so that's really how you output those and create those spatial objects. So that's a quick overview about spatial process. I could show a bit more, but now you've learned quite a bit about that wonderful spatial process tool and the buffer tool, things that you can use to actually create those spatial processes. But I want to skip on over to maps because maps are really cool and it's something awesome that you can actually use very often in Alteryx. So to do that, I'm going to go over to another workflow here and I'm going to bring in those stores and trade areas just like before. So I'm going to look at this and say, go back to my file. Let's bring in stores and trade areas. Now for about 3 weeks, got those stores and trade areas in the Denver area. So what if I want to make a map for all of these areas and I want to actually make a map of census tracts and median household income with these stores and trade areas overlaid on top of it? I can actually do that pretty quickly in Alteryx. So I'm going to go over back to my demographic analysis tools and pull in an allocate input tool because I want to start with census tracts. So I'm using input to actually start with a boundary. I use append if I already have a boundary, such as my custom trade areas or my combined trade area that we just saw earlier. So now I'm going to do the input tool, and I want to do census tracts. And then I'm just going to click on Colorado. So I want all of the census tracts in Colorado. And I'm going to show what that looks like when I run the workflow here. So there's about 1249 census tracts in Colorado. And now I'm actually going to go back and choose a variable for that. So my variable will be under basic variables, current year estimates, income, and then I'm going to go to household. So you saw last week we kind of looked at a lot of the options inside of these variables. I'm going to choose median household income for my variable. I'm going to go ahead and click Run. So now it's going to show me the median household income per census tract based on the census tract key here. Here's my median household income per tract for all 1,249 tracts here. Now that I've got this data, I want to create a thematic map. So I'm going to go back to my reporting tools and show you not only how to make a report map, but how to output it as a PDF or other option. So here's my report map tool. I'm going to bring this in, and then I'm going to actually start pulling in data. So you'll be able to see what this looks like with the data for each one. So with my input data, I am first going to input census tracts here as my first input. And when I click on the configuration for the report map window, you'll see there's 4 tabs here. So there's a settings tab. I'm going to leave these as default so that my base map is the TomTom map that comes with the spatial or location analytics data bundle with Alteryx. That is an additional purchase with Alteryx, just like the Experian demographic data are. But now you see a data tab. So there's a data tab and a layers tab. Data is where you configure your data coming into the report map tool. Layers is how you configure graphically what those layers are going to look like on your map. So you get into the graphic design side of your map as well. Legend is, I've got a lot of defaults here. I'm not going to change much, but I will show you something if we have time on how to do a separate legend. So here's my data. It's based on the connections. You can see input connection number 1. So if I click on input connection number 1, I've got some options. Here is my spatial object, and I want to actually theme on this. My thematic field is going to be that variable from the Experian data for median household income. So I'm just going to click on that variable. So I've got this configured now. Now I want to bring in a second input. I'm going to bring in the trade areas here. And as you see, it's going to be connection number 2. I'm going to click here and then go to data. Here's incoming connection number 2. You can rename your connections. So if you want to click on the wire itself, you can actually just change the name here. So just showing a little tip and trick there. If you want to call that trade areas coming in, you can do that. Or you can call it census tracts for number 1. In the interest of time, I'm just going to leave it as number 2 there. And I want to choose my spatial object. So with stores and trade areas, I have a store spatial object with a point, and I have the trade area. So I'm actually going to call this one trade areas. I'm actually going to change this to where it's no other. I'm not going to change it. I'm going to leave it as a default here. And then I'm going to bring in input number 3. So I'm going to show you a tip and trick. It's already got this as input number 2. If I want to make a copy of data, just add a select tool. So now I'm going to connect this to a select tool. It's going to keep all of my field map. So all of my fields coming in, I'm just making a copy so that I can have input number 3. So using that select tool, I've made a copy. Now I have a new input number 3. Now I go to my report map tool, go back to data. Here's input number 3. I want that to be my store spatial object. I also want to label my stores with the store number. So I have some labeling options here as well. So now that I've got all the data in, I actually want to now go to the layers side of things and configure those layers. So for the first layer, I'm going to do stores. It's a points layer. So I click on this little add layer button with the circle and the plus sign. It's a points layer, points number 1. And actually, with my layer, for points, it's actually number 3, because number 1 was the census tracts. So I'm going to click on this one and actually delete it here. So it is input number 3 for the stores. And I have a default item here from my point style. I can click on style here. I'm actually going to keep the style here and say, oh, let's see, maybe I want to actually change it to 14 for my size. Make those a little bigger, so I can click on 14 here. And I have a point style. I can click on this and change it. So I've got a lot of other options, such as a circle, a square, a star, and so on. I'm going to keep it as a default for the diamond. And then I'm going to go to label. So for my labels, I actually want to change the font a little bit. I'm going to expand this a bit so you can see it. So I'm going to change the font, keep it Arial but bold. I'm going to change the font size to 12. And then I think I'll do an outline color. So those labels are outlined. They're going to outline in white, actually. So going back to my input, I can change this layer name, and I'm just going to call it stores. I also want to uncheck zoom to layer. I don't want the resulting map to zoom to the store layer. I actually want it to zoom to my trade areas. So I'm going to uncheck zoom to layer here, but I do want to show it in the legend. Disable is really useful if you're testing and want to perfect that map. You can disable and make sure that some things don't show, and then go back and enable it also. So now that I've got my stores, I'm going to input my census tracts. So my census tracts are a polygon, and they were input number 1. So now I've got layer name number 1. I'm going to call that census tracts. And then I'm going to say not a zoom to layer because I want it to zoom area, which we'll configure next. But I do want to theme on the census tract. And because in data, for input number 1, we have a thematic field that we set up. Now we can actually set up a theme or a ranged color on that thematic map for census tracts. So I'm going to expand next to census tracts, and then I'm going to click on theme. Theme shows up automatically because I have a variable to theme on in my data tab. So with theme, we do have a lot of options. You can do equal records, equal ranges. You can manually tile. You can do a unique value, such as if you had a responder value of yes or no, you could set that up as a unique value. I'm going to keep mine as smart tile. I'm going to let it choose the ranges for me. I can go back in and manually change those ranges if I want to, once I use smart tile. There's also an option for ramp. I'm going to ramp these colors. I'm going to ramp them from blue to red. So I'm going to click on blue, and I can actually change my colors with the color palette here. So I'm going to choose a little more medium blue there and leave the end color as red. I did want to show if I do map, there is an option for unique colors, and you have all of these wonderful preset map ranges for unique colors here. So I can actually do that if I want to do some unique values. I'm going to go back and make sure that's ramp, and it's got my blue to my red. So you'll notice if I'm doing smart tile, it's setting those ranges for me, and now I've got a high to low. I can go in and actually manually change a lot of things about my style. I can hatch that style, I can change an outline color, and so on in my theme. But I'm just going to leave it as what it created for me in that theme as well. But I can also go in and manually type and change the actual name as well on that theme if I need to. So now I've got my theme, and I want to configure one more layer. So I want to do those store trade areas as well before I actually do an output. So I know those trade areas are a polygon. It was input number 2. If I renamed my wire connections, I could see easily, oh, this is census tract, or this is, a trade area. But in the interest of time, I'll just leave them as is. So here's input number 2. This is going to be trade areas. I want to keep zoom to layer here, so it zooms to that layer and not to all the census tracts in Colorado. That way I have a nice close-up view of all of those 10 store trade areas. I'm going to actually change the style. You'll notice when I expanded this, there's not a theme option here, and that's because in my data tab, I don't set for number 2 for trade areas. I don't really need to make a theme on that one at this time anyway. So I'm going to keep my color as black. I'm going to change from use fill color yes to no. I don't want a fill color. I just want a black outline, and I'm going to change the opacity to 100. That makes it a solid black line there. So now I've got this all configured for all of my options. I wanted to quickly show you do have base layers for your base map, which is the TomTom data. You can change all of the configuration for each of those base layers as well. So here's your polygon base layer, there's your points base layer, and so on. And you can change each of these and configure those as well on the fly in this map tool. So I've got this one set up. And I'm going to actually add a browse very quickly just to give a preview of what this map looks like. So now that I've got the browse going, 2.2 seconds to pull in all that data, now I've got a really nice looking map. And I've got a map here. See if you can scroll down a little. See the labels of the stores. Here's my trade areas, and here's my ranges by census tract that are pre-configured using the ranges that I let Alteryx choose for me. And now you can see the colors. So there's median household income. So high is in the red. So you can quickly see where those higher median household incomes are and the lower household incomes as well. And our trade areas and stores overlaid on top of it. So this is just an image. This is not a PDF. You can actually save from here as a JPEG, but I want to do a little bit more with this and actually create a report. So in the interest of time, I'm going to pull in some more reporting tools. I want to add a report text tool here. And this report text tool will allow me to put text on top of the map and in my report. So my field name is going to be text. I am going to attach it to the map, and I'm going to place it above the map. So I'm just going to call this my first map. You can use this to actually have available fields. If you leave more fields coming in from your input, you can actually use those to iterate through and say store 100 map, store 101 map, and so on. But for this, I'm just going to make a really quick text. I'm also going to bold this as well. You can change the font, you can add a hyperlink, and so on. I'm just going to keep this as is. And then I'm going to add a layout. So for my layout, I'm going to actually, this is where we get into the graphic design of everything. So with my layout mode, I'm going to say each individual record. I'm going to say, let's make it vertical. Right now I only have a map, but I'm setting this up for a reason. And then we're going to see what the output looks like on each of these. So now I've got a layout, and this is very useful if you had, say, a chart and a table to set up your configuration. You could say which is on top, which is to the side, and so on. But for this one, I'm going to just add a header, and I'm going to leave the report header as its very simple configuration. It's just going to be Alteryx report. It's going to include the date when it runs, and it's going to have the Alteryx logo. You can change your logo with a custom image, and you can change your report title and lots of other options there. And then I'm going to render this. So render is the output tool for reporting in Alteryx. So I'm going to add a render here. And with my render, I'm actually going to keep it as a temporary PDF. So I want to make sure that that's my PDF here, and this is my data field is layout. I do have a header, which is header. I want to make sure and show the header on the first page. This is only going to be one map. And I left it as a temporary PDF, but you can output as an HTML, a Word, an Excel, a PowerPoint, and so on. If it outputs to PowerPoint, there's a real benefit there because every element is output separately. So you can move your title around, you can move your map around. It's not output as a static JPEG that you can't do anything with on your PowerPoint slide. It's actually output with separate elements. So now I'm going to click Run. And I know we've only got 12 minutes left, but I want to show you two really cool things with this as well. So you can see it rendered. Again, anytime you have a link for your output, you can just click on it. And then here is my Alteryx report with today's date, the Alteryx logo, my first map, a really nice looking map, and then here's your legend. But I'll show you something cool. What if you want to put your legend at the bottom as a separate element and have a bigger map to look at? You can actually do that. So I'm actually going to go back and click back on my map tool for report map, and then legend. Instead of layout to the right, I'm going to say separate field. Let's make this a separate field, and then I can actually change it in the layout. So now you can see I've got a map and a legend in my layout. I'm going to click on this, and I'm going to keep the alignment of center, but maybe I want a border around all of it, and I want a separator between the map and the legend. I can actually set that up. I want to make sure my orientation's vertical, so it's not setting the map and layout side by side. It was doing that earlier for the map and legend. So now I've got it vertical, got everything set where my map's on top, my legend's on the bottom, and now I can run again. So I'm going to look at this and see what comes out in my PDF. And now you have a really nice looking close-up view of your first map. I've got a border around both of those, and now I have my legends separately at the bottom, so it's a separate mapping element. If I output this to PowerPoint, each of these would be separate, and I can move them around on the PowerPoint slide. So next, I want to show you something really cool. So here, I'm actually going to go into the data, and for my stores and trade areas, I want to go back into the allocate demographic analysis tools, and I want to add an allocate report. So there's a bunch of canned reports in Alteryx, and there's a lot of demographic reports that you can bring in. So I'm going to just add an allocate report here, and I'm going to connect it to my stores and trade areas. So with my allocate report, I actually have a lot of options inside of there. I'm going to make sure that it is a custom geography for my allocate reports, and I'm going to change my spatial field to the trade area. I'm going to change my name field to the store number also. And then there's a lot of options for my reports. So I can do a basic demographic comparison report, business comparison, and so on. I'm going to choose a complete demographic summary report. Again, this is a pre-canned report. Some of these do use an index base. You can actually choose your index, whether it be block groups, census tracts, the state, or so on. I'm just going to do this demographic complete summary report. And then I'm going to actually add something neat. So I'm going to set up a file path, and I'm going to burst to a shared directory. So here you can see I actually have a directory here, See Alteryx Reports. It says, this folder is empty. I'm going to set up a file path that will actually burst those reports for me into that directory and create subdirectories for me on the fly. So here I'm going to add a formula tool. And for my file path, I'm actually going to do an add column. I'm going to call this file path. And then I've got a script already written here, just in the interest of time. It's in this comment tool. So what this script is doing, and if you can see here, it's creating subdirectories under See Alteryx Reports, a subdirectory for the field of city, another subdirectory for the field of store number, adding text of store before it, and then another option of store based on the store number and demographic report.pdf. So it's going to name the demographic report for me using this store plus store number plus demographic report.pdf. So I'm going to copy this and put this into my file path. I could type it, but in the interest of time, I'll leave it as is. So here's my file path. It's just a formula. The key to using the file path option is to actually use the render tool in the reporting tools. So I'm going to go back to my reporting options. And now in render, I'm going to add a render tool here. And to do this option, I need to choose a specific output file. So I'm going to navigate to an output file. I'm going to call this one See Alteryx. And let's see, Alteryx Reports. And then with that, I'm going to call it demographic report.pdf. So this is really just a placeholder. In fact, I'll leave that extension off and just leave it as a .pdf. So this is actually just a placeholder for what's going to happen next. It's going to add that store number to the demographic report. I want to group my data into separate reports. My field to group on is file path, and I want to replace the entire path with the group. So I'm replacing the entire path here with the file path, and that's what it's going to group on. My data fields, the allocate report. I want to insert section breaks between the records. And then, let's see, I think I've got everything else set for this to run. So again, going back to this option, nothing in the See Alteryx Reports. And then I'm going to go ahead and click Run. Before I do that, I'm going to actually contain this one so that it doesn't make this report also. So you saw me right-click, add container, and then disable the container. I'm just disabling that output. So now I'm going to run. And then you'll see here, as it's running, it's going to tell you all the reports that it's generating. So let's see, it should have actually quite a few more reports here. And of course, it's only during a WebEx that this happens. But let me check that, oh, see Alteryx reports, demographic report there. Let me make sure this is running properly on the file path. I've got store number as a field coming in. Of course, this always works perfectly. Field to group on, file path. There we go. Something got clicked. And now we'll run. And that's going to replace all of the options with the file path. You see it's creating each one of these one at a time. If I click on the records, now you can see it created a report here for each one of these. If I go back to this, it's actually doing Alteryx reports for each one of these, and then it's bursting the report per store and per city. So I do need to go back and tweak that file path a bit. But while I'm doing that, I did want to open it up for questions because I know we're really close to time here also.
Thanks, Deanna. Yes, we do have a couple questions from the audience. So to kick us off, are there pre-formatted demographic reports for business data, like consumer data?
There are actually. So very good question on that. So not only do I have a demographic comparison, but I have a business comparison report. I can do it by major industries and summaries. There's also consumer expenditures. So I can do by apparel, by auto, and so on. So there's a lot of options for your consumer expenditure reports. And then as I scroll down, there's actually daytime population, demographic snapshots, and then executive summaries. I can even get into housing units, income, and then the mosaic options. So I can pull in a mosaic cluster comparison report and a summary index report using an index, say, of comparing all of the mosaic segments for my trade areas versus what's the mosaic segment prominence for the state. I can actually do both of those as well. So I can use all of these options inside of these pre-canned reports. To show you what the reports look like, I'll just open up demographicreport.pdf. And now you can see that complete demographic summary report. Here it is for store 100. It's date stamped. And now here's the wealth of the data that's just in that demographic summary report. And I didn't have to write any lines of code or anything to modify this. This is just a pre-formatted report that comes with Alteryx when you buy the business summary data set as well.
Great. Thank you, Deanna. Another question, is it possible to digitize a polygon? And then what happens if you want to delete or make points within the polygon?
Yes, excellent question on that. So you saw when we actually created the polygon earlier and we output it as a region.kml. If you need to modify a polygon, there are poly build tools where you can actually create a build or create a polygon. But first you would split that polygon with the poly split tool. And then you would take each of those vertices. You can delete vertices, you can move the vertices. Once you have that adjusted, use your poly build to build that polygon again from a series of points. So excellent question on that.
Thanks, Deanna. And then final question, because of the time, can you leverage the TomTom data set to get a line created between 2 points based on driving routes and not just a crow fly straight line?
Yes, that's a very good question. So there is a lot of TomTom data behind the scenes, such as local roads and so on. You can definitely use the formula tool to create straight lines between areas. So what you would do is bring in the formula tool, and then in the formulas, you would actually, in the pre-formatted functions, go to Spatial, and then it would actually be create line from point 1 or point 2. So you'd use this create line option, but it only creates a straight line. So I need to double check on if you can access the TomTom data behind the scenes using those local roads, and then use that as a way to create a line for those local roads. It would depend on the license agreement with TomTom, but I can definitely check on that, and then I can post that as an answer to the question also. But you can certainly do straight lines using this formula of spatial tools, straight lines between points 1 and 2, and so on.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Deanna. And unfortunately, we've run out of time, so this now brings our webinar to a close. Thank you all for attending today's session, and have a great rest of your day.
Thank you all very much, and I look forward to talking with you in the near future, especially if you come to the Inspire conferences.